Throughout history, various forms of inflicting excruciating pain, both psychological and physical, have been used for various reasons. They range from slowly ripping people apart, to making thousands of small cuts before executing someone, to more psychologically scarring things like dripping water on someone's head for hours on end. The umbrella term for these acts involving excruciating pain is torture. But what exactly is torture? What are the motivations behind it? And how is it justified? Well, to start off, let's define torture exactly. After all, there's many ways of inflicting physical or psychological pain on someone that wouldn't usually be considered torture. So, to make it more clear what I mean by torture, I'll use a definition given by Mark P. Donnelly and Daniel Deal in their book, The Big Book of Pain. In this book, they distinguish between torture and regular acts of violence by who is allowing the torture and what its purpose is. Specifically, in order to qualify as torture, it must be sanctioned by a higher power for some purpose, whether or not that purpose really makes any sense or is right or wrong. This means that some group that has power or authority over the victim of torture, whether that's societal power structures or an actual powerful entity like a government or militia, is allowing for the torture. This also means that any use of excruciating pain by a government counts as torture. Now, this isn't a perfect definition, but it does work to differentiate torture from regular acts of violence. For example, if I just came up to you and started beating the crap out of you randomly, you'd probably think I'm a very mean person, and it might be very excruciating, but you'd probably not consider it torture. And even if you prosecuted me in a court, the judge and the jury probably wouldn't consider it torture either. Now that we've defined torture, we can look at some of the ways it's been used and justified throughout history. The first obvious use is punishment. Torture for punishment has been used by almost every major civilization throughout history in one way or another. But why? If a person has committed some heinous crime, why not just execute them quickly? Why was there a need to make the death so brutal? Was it for order? For justice? Was it because of religious reasons? Or did some people just really, really like the brutality of the torture? Well, the answer is yes. Torture has been done for all of these reasons, including the last one, unfortunately. I mean, you'd think you'd have to be a pretty sadistic person to become a torture master. So there's a lot of reasons why torture has been used and why it's been so prevalent. Most of the time, torture was a show of power to intimidate the public or some group of people and keep order. In fact, most punishments involving torture were made public spectacles for this exact reason, as well as giving people some entertainment. I mean, there wasn't a lot else to do in medieval times. A classic example of a very intimidating punishment is impalement. In this torture, the victim was impaled with a long spear, usually starting in their anus and ending up somewhere else in the upper body. At first, it seems like this might be a quick death, but this often wasn't true. Usually, the long spear was pushed through the victim's body slowly, and expert impalers were able to purposely miss vital organs so that the victim would survive and suffer longer. Yeah. The most prolific impaler was Vlad the Impaler. During his reign, he impaled over 20,000 people, including women and children. Now, while I'm sure the guy really enjoyed impaling people, it was also a large show of power and intimidation. The impaled bodies would remain for a long period of time, a constant reminder of whatever crimes they had committed. Anyone seeing this torture, or any type of torturous punishment for that matter, would understand the message clearly. Don't mess with the government and abide by the law. And torture was effective enough at sending this message that it was used by many civilizations for this exact purpose. It was more the illusion of power and control that allowed civilizations to stay in power. While almost all torture could be traced back to control of the people, the practice was also done simply in spite of the person being punished. The breaking wheel was a good example of how torture could be used for this purpose. In this torture, the victim would lay down on a wooden wheel, often with spikes at their joints, and would be beaten with a hammer. This would break the bones of the victim, but would not kill them. Only after the torture would the victim be executed. Now, obviously this would be very painful, but it was also believed that being beaten on the breaking wheel actually damned that person in the afterlife. Thus, it also served as a kind of ritual to ensure that the person being tortured would not get into heaven for their crimes. Governments weren't the only high power to use torture, however. In some cases, the source of torture actually came from religious powers. A good example of this is witches. Throughout the Middle Ages, people in Europe were terrified of witches. But specifically in the 15 and 1600s, there was a lot of fear. So much that about 80,000 suspected witches were put to death in Europe at this time. and the punishments for being convicted of a witch, or even just being suspected of being one, was torture. One form of punishment used on suspected witches was dunking. In this punishment, the suspected witch would be dunked into water if they did not confess to being a witch. Often, this dunking would result in the suspected witch dying from drowning. I classify this as punishment and not interrogation because regardless if the victim confessed or not, they would most likely die. The reason witches were persecuted like this was partially out of fear, but also to instill fear into the public of committing sinful acts. While torture was originally used exclusively for punishment, it eventually was used for interrogation as well. And as it evolved as a method for interrogation, so did the way it was performed. Instead of heading right into torture, the person being interrogated was shown all the torture devices that would be used on them. Torture masters would also describe the torture process in brutal detail to scare the victim. In many cases, the psychological fear of being tortured was enough for people to fess up. Sometimes this would mean that the person wasn't tortured, but in a lot of cases, the person was still tortured regardless. The issue with this method of interrogation is that a person would make a confession, regardless of if that confession was true or false, just to get out of torture. This made the confessions very unreliable as a source of truth. But this was completely fine for the ones doing the torturing because they were almost never looking for the truth anyways. Instead, they were looking for a specific confession, one that would almost always benefit the higher power giving the torture. Sometimes this was taken to extremes. An example of this is when King Philip IV of France decided to arrest thousands of Knight Templars to make them confess to crimes that they didn't commit. The reason for this wasn't because he actually thought they had committed crimes, but just because he didn't want to pay money that he owed to them. After he had done this, he also seized their land and property for himself. And even though most of the Templars were probably innocent, they were all punished for the crimes that they had confessed to. This shows how powerful of a tool torture could be for a leader. And this was exactly what it was, a tool, not a legitimate way of determining innocence. And you may think that the people doing the torturing really believed that torture did get the truth out of people, but history tells us otherwise. An example that demonstrates this very well is when John Felton stabbed the Duke of Buckingham to death. The English government had thought he had conspired with others to commit the crime, and so threatened him with torture if he did not confess who his accomplices were. But before Felton could be tortured, he delivered one of the coolest lines in history. He told his torture master, "I do not believe, my lord, that it is the king's wish, for he is a just and gracious prince, and will not have his subjects to be tortured against the law. Yet this I must tell you, by the way, that if I be put upon the rack, I will accuse you, my lord Dorset, and none but yourself, as my accomplice." Now, this shook up Lord Dorset quite a bit, as it would anybody at that time. That's because all confessions from torture were taken as the truth. And so if Felton had actually accused Lord Dorset as his only accomplice, Dorset would be as dead as him. Felton was later hanged without being tortured. This example demonstrates that even the people doing the torturing were well aware that it really didn't lead to the truth. And it also demonstrates some of the drawbacks of torture. After the massive atrocities committed during World War II, the UN decided to create international laws banning torture and any form of cruel and unusual punishments. Although many countries had already banned torture, this was the first time where many basic human rights were internationally recognized and put into codes. However, this hasn't stopped countries in the UN from using torture, often as a method of interrogation. A well-known example is the United States' use of torture in the war in Afghanistan after the 2001 terrorist attacks. However, many other countries have used torture since World War II, often for the purpose of interrogation, but also for punishment. And the torture is used for interrogation despite the fact that it's known that torture does not lead to reliable confessions. This is really just history repeating itself. Countries throughout history have banned torture in law, but for one reason or another, major leaders of the country sanction it for specific purposes. In fact, technically torture has been illegal in England since 1215 after Magna Carta, which said that kings were not above the law. But not only was torture definitely still used, it was most often allowed by kings who believed they were above the law. I think what the modern use of torture demonstrates is that torture never really went away, even with the massive developments in human rights and ethics. Instead, it just became more hidden. So while I think we can all be glad that we don't live in a time where our nose can be cut off for disobeying the emperor, we do still need to consider that some groups of people still can undergo torture, and that it's often done by the institutions that many consider to be just and ethical.